次はボレス君の発表です。ボレス君はボリビアからの国家留学3年です。それではお願いします。
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Boris Silvers, and I would like to present you my thesis, which is named The Study of the Market-Related Cultural and Emotional Causes of Consumer Satisfaction. I belong to Professor Sankawa Laboratory, and the presentation will take around 40 minutes. My presentation has 6 parts. The first part is introduction. I will be talking about the main purpose of this research and the objectives to achieve this purpose. Then I will be talking about the contents, the main contents of the thesis, which is the influence of market share on consumer satisfaction, the influence of culture on consumer satisfaction, the influence of emotions on CS. Finally, I will be talking briefly about the overall conclusions, and finally we'll talk about the managerial implications and the future research. So let me start with the introduction from chapter 1 in the thesis. Overall, what I can say is that if you check the literature about consumer satisfaction, you will realize that in the last 30 years there has been a lot of advances in consumer satisfaction research. And the main topic of consumer satisfaction research was trying to relate financial outcomes with consumer satisfaction. So with this objective, many researchers have found that there are 3 main determinants of CS, which we call it perceived quality, perceived value, and image. And more or less we can call it, these are the traditional consumer satisfaction research determinants. So in the overall 30 years there have been a lot of research on this area, and they have found a lot of many different topics of research on this. Nowadays, let's say in the last 10 years, there has been some changes in the research areas, and new researchers have been trying to introduce new determinants of CS, like market share, culture, or emotions. So I call these the new consumer satisfaction research determinants or causes. So the main purpose of this research is to try to attempt to integrate both waves of research, the traditional and the modern consumer satisfaction research, into holistic models that I will be presenting you in the following slides. To achieve this purpose, the first objective of this research is to clarify the mechanisms that govern the relationship between market share and consumer satisfaction. There is a very famous research that was made by Cornell in 1995, and he basically proposed that the relationship between market share and consumer satisfaction is negative or inexistent. If you think about it, it sounds kind of counterintuitive, because why companies would try to invest in consumer satisfaction if they are not going to see any return or any growth in their market share? This idea has some shortcomings. First of all, it did not consider mass customization or the technological changes, because nowadays companies are able to address the individual needs of their consumers almost at scale levels. Second, it did also not consider that companies nowadays are operating in different environments in developing and developed countries. Therefore, the needs and the things that consumers want in different countries are completely different. Moreover, it did not consider culture, because there is a social interdependence of the consumer. The relationship between industries and companies are different from country to country. Therefore, additionally, Cornell did not also consider some very human phenomenon that's called keeping up with the Joneses. What it basically means is, if my neighbor buys an iPhone, I would also like to buy an iPhone. And I'm not making any kind of rational decision, or I'm not following any kind of topics that Cornell has considered in the previous research. Therefore, becomes the idea if this relationship actually is true or not, what are the conditions under which it's governed. The second objective is to try to explain the influences of culture on consumer satisfaction at the individual level. There has been some very famous research, like theories of the rational agent model, that used to consider that the needs of preferences and needs of consumers are independent of culture. However, even a Nobel Prize winner like Akerlof has realized that this is not true. There's a false premise that the tastes and preferences of consumers are independent of culture. Moreover, there has been globalization in the last years, and there has been the false belief that the tastes of consumers will be standardized. And as you may see, it is not true. Most of the companies have to adapt their preferences to the consumers where they are operating, the markets where they are operating. And following these ideas, there has been researchers like Mosh and Hofstede that have found that culture actually influences consumer behavior. What they found, for example, is that in companies with high masculinity, consumers tend to buy more expensive watches because masculinity makes them try to show off. And more research also has found that culture influences consumer satisfaction. And at the same time, other researchers have found that culture influences the determinants of consumer satisfaction. Therefore, there is inconclusive evidence whether this relationship is direct or mediated. So what I want to check in this research is how this works, whether the relationship is direct or mediated. The third objective is to develop consumer satisfaction models that take account of emotional processes. Again, this very famous theory in social sciences, like the rational agent model, used to consider that emotions were inconsistent, were subjective, and not objectively accessible. And they basically thought that consumer satisfaction or consumer research in general was a rational process. So they could model rational process only checking what are the choices of consumers. However, there has been research from psychological area, from behavioral economics and other areas that have found that emotions are actually accessible, they're consistent, are influential. And even rationality has some limits. When you get to a certain point in rationality, you do not make any more optimal choices. And even there is a more complex and even philosophical thought that consumer satisfaction and determinants are named generally as attitudes. And attitudes are governed by psychological principles. And as you know, psychological principles and psychological things do not work necessarily rational. They could also be irrational. So what I want to see in the third objective is to use emotions in evaluative judgments. For doing this, I developed the following structural model that I will be developing little by little in the following slides. Now let's talk about the contents of the research. First, the influence of market share on consumer satisfaction. What I basically want to see is the influence of market share on consumer satisfaction, and for doing this, I wrote the chapter Cross-Country Comparison of the Mechanisms Related to Consumer Satisfaction and Market Share. As I previously introduced, there is a famous research made by Fornell in 1995 that proposed that the relationship between market share and consumer satisfaction is negative or inexistent. This idea was based on the ideal point model, which basically proposed that when you have a small market or a niche market, the deviation from what the consumers want and what they actually receive is quite small. In other words, when you have small market, you as a company are able to satisfy all your consumers because you can give them more or less like personalized services or products. However, when the market grows, the deviations become more, and the company has to standardize their processes. And due to these higher deviations, we will have more unsatisfied consumers. Similarly, following this idea, Helof and Jacobson have basically analyzed the influence of perceived quality on the market share, the perceived quality on market share, and they have found again that this relationship is negative with the same process. But when you have small markets, you can offer high quality to your consumers, but when your market grows, you cannot give them all that they want, and therefore the perceived quality will be lower. So we expect a negative correlation or a correlation between market share and consumer satisfaction and perceived quality. Other researchers have followed the same idea, and they found interesting similar results. For example, in the case of perceived value, when you're a follower in the market, you basically offer a good product with a low price. So basically, you're offering high perceived value and low market share. However, when you're a leader, you do not much care about the price, or you follow a non-price competition strategy, and you're offering low perceived value and will have a high market share. Again, this relation becomes negative. So what I wanted to see is to prove or test the theory of Fornell that there's a negative relationship between market share, customer satisfaction, and its determinants, in this case, perceived quality, perceived value, and image. The second hypothesis was to see whether this relationship actually holds at industry and country level. Actually, what are the main characteristics that make this relationship actually universal or not? There is research from the cultural area, from Vancouver, for example, that